All right, everybody, welcome. I'm very, very pleased to introduce today's speaker in our Distinguished Speaker Series, Professor David Rand. He is the Irwin H. Shell Professor and Professor of Management Science and Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT and Director of the Applied Cooperation Team. David Rand is a very interdisciplinary scholar, so he really fits in well here at the iSchool. You would be amazed at the different fields he publishes in. For example, his co-authored papers, well, first of all, that have been awarded Best Paper Award of the Year in Experimental Economics, Social Cognition, and Political Methodology. But he's also published in Nature, Science, PNAS, American Economic Review, Psychological Science, Management Science, New England Journal of Medicine, and American Journal of Political Science. So I see about 8 fields in that list. So a person after our own heart here at the iSchool, where we do a lot of interdisciplinary work. It's also received numerous awards, including the 2020 Federation of Associations of Behavioral and Brain Sciences Early Career Impact Award, and Wired Magazine Smart List 2012 of 50 people who will change the world. I think that's an accurate description of the research that he's doing. So let's all give a warm welcome to Professor David Rand.
Thanks so much for the invite. It's great to be here. Thanks everybody for coming out despite the circumstances. Yeah, so I'm excited to tell you about like a new project that I'm working on. I have like a standard misinformation talk that I've given 10,000 times, and it's very exciting to not be giving that talk. I want to start actually by just acknowledging all the many different people that are part of my group. And the work that I'm talking about today is led primarily by Jenny Allen and Cameron Martell, who are great PhD students that will be on the job market in the next year or two. So keep your eye out. And also all the people that gave us money. And from a conflict of interest perspective, say I get research funding from Meta and from Google. And relevant for the talk today, I'm on the advisory board for Birdwatch, which is Twitter's fact check, or like crowdsource thing, although I don't get any money from that. Like in the context of our current political moment, there is a lot of concern around polarization, in the sense that like there's great dislike for people from across the aisle, and that this kind of affective polarization has been increasing, and there's it's a really major source of concern. And I do work on depolarization and stuff like that. There's like the polarization problem, but then also in parallel to the polarization problem, there's a problem with misinformation, and often these are discussed in combination with the idea that like polarization helps drive misinformation and misinformation sharing. I think actually the evidence for that is pretty weak, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Anyways, what I'm going to talk about today is a different perspective on how polarization and misinformation can come together. But I guess as just basic, like ground setting, misinformation doesn't need a huge amount of introduction, but obviously falsehoods have been around since language has been around. But there's this particular flavor that starting in the 2016 election cycle in the US and Brexit in the UK got a lot of attention, which are these totally false claims posted online, shared widely. And during COVID, there was this like infodemic in parallel to the epidemic of lots of false claims about COVID being circulated. The 2020 election had its own new flavor of misinformation. And so most of what my group does is study this kind of misinformation and try and understand things like why people fall for misinformation, why people share misinformation, and what to do about it. And so this review article and Gord Pennycook is like my main partner in crime in misinformation research. And so Gord and I have this review article that summarizes a lot of that for folks that are so inclined. But what I'm going to talk about today is the question of how to combat misinformation. And I'm going to argue that actually polarization may play a different role in combating misinformation than you might expect. As the title suggests, I'm going to suggest that actually polarization might wind up being helpful here. But before we get there, the more basic question of just like, how should you combat misinformation in the first place? And in addressing this, I'm going to focus particularly on misinformation on social media. which I think, contrary to a lot of narratives, but I guess in line with something that you guys heard about earlier this semester, I don't actually think that social media companies are necessarily, or platforms are necessarily the place where the most misinformation is happening. And it's not that I study it because that's where all the misinformation is, but rather I study misinformation on social media because that's the place where there's some potential for actual intervention, because the organization that is distributing the news, which is the platform, is different from the organization that's producing the news. So I think like Fox News, for example, is a major source of misinformation, but there's no room for intervention there. Because like if we figured something out that would like reduce the the misinformation acceptance of Fox News viewers, Fox News would not be interested in doing that because they're doing it on purpose. And so here, like social media platforms, you have this like room for intervention. And so that's why I think it's a particularly relevant place to study this. And so given that, the first question is, okay, so how do platforms combat misinformation? And given that social media companies are first and foremost technology companies, the primary approach is a technological solution, which is using machine learning to like make classifiers, figure out what is misinformation, and then okay, then we know what it is. But and that's great. And I'm a big fan of machine learning, so one of my best friends are computers. But I think that in the context of misinformation identification, it's only going to take you so far, because it turns out that it's really hard to make a good training set. Like before I started working on this, I was like, oh, it's easy. There's true, there's false things, and if the platforms cared about it, they would just sort it out. Once you start working on it, you realize actually it's way more complicated than that. And stuff exists along this continuum of like there's some stuff that's really obviously false and some stuff that's really obviously true, but most stuff is somewhere in the middle. And so it makes it hard to come up with good training sets. And also there's a non-stationarity problem where misinformation is always evolving. And so if you're training on yesterday's data, you're always kind of behind. So I think there's a recognition that you need some kind of human in the loop. And the way that that typically works is by partnering with professional fact-checking organizations like Snopes or PolitiFact or whatever, where you've got like trained professionals that spend lots of time doing detailed research on claims and decide whether it's true or false or mixed or whatever. And that also is great. I'm a big fan of professional fact-checking. The problem with professional fact-checking is it doesn't scale. Because there's just an approximately infinite amount of content that is posted every day, and there's a handful of fact-checkers, even in the US, let alone other parts of the world where there's no professional fact-checking infrastructure at all, and there's just no way they can possibly keep up. So what I'm going to talk about today is how do you kind of try and scale that. But I guess I should say before that, so what do you do with this? Like once you've identified false claims, as it is now via either machine learning or professional fact-checkers, you can either demote it, so they push it down the newsfeed so people are just less likely to see it, or they can put a warning label on it. And again, both of these things I think are great. Like by definition, if you demote something, people are going to be less likely to see it. And if you put a warning label on it, people are going to be less likely to believe it and less likely to share it. We've got a bunch of research on it that suggests warning labels really are quite effective. Even people that say they don't trust fact checkers and don't want to see fact checks, if you put a warning label on something, it makes them less likely to believe it and less likely to share it. So like the basic infrastructure in some sense, I think is really effective. That is, once they've decided that something is a bad piece of content, they can really effectively prevent people from seeing it or believing it or sharing it. But the question is this issue of scalability, like how do you do this at scale? And the approach that I'm going to talk about today involves the wisdom of crowds. This is more than 100 years of research that I'm sure people are familiar with, basically aggregating the opinions of lay people can produce judgments as good or better than the judgments of experts. Also, as a side note, I was a biologist when I began my academic life. And then I read The Wisdom of Crowds by James Surowiecki when I was starting grad school. And I was like, that's cool. And that's sort of what started me down the road to being a social scientist. So anyways, we know that the wisdom of crowds can work in all different kinds of contexts. What we want to know is how can it work in the context of these kind of really hyper-polarized settings involving news and misinformation. And it's a place where a lot of people might think, given the really great level of sectarian strife and stuff like that in the US right now, things are not going to work well in this context because people are doing motivated reasoning and strategic action and all that. So that's what we want to know. And in a prior study, we assessed just like the basic performance of of the crowd. And we did this in collaboration with Facebook, who are designing Community Review, which is their like crowdsourced fact checking or like layperson fact checking product. And we got from them a set of URLs that they wanted fact checks on, either because they had some reason from their algorithms to think it might be bad, or just because it was going viral or about an important topic. And this is really important that we're using actual headlines that they wanted, because you could make the crowd look really good by using trivially easy ones. You could make the crowd look really bad by using really hard ones. And so here, the question of ecological validity is really important. You want to know, for the actual things that need evaluation, how does the crowd do? So we get this set of these claims. We hire 3 professional fact checkers to read each article in detail and assess its accuracy. And then we also recruit about 1,100 Americans from Amazon Mechanical Turk. And we have them just read the headline and lead and rate that. And again, we're doing this because we're going for scalability. So we want to say, can we just have this really minimal crowd interaction? Will that, like, how far will that get us? We also randomized whether we showed them the source domain or not, because there's sort of conflicting evidence on whether that would help or hurt or not do anything. So let's see. Both the fact checkers and the Turkers rate the accuracy of the articles using some Likert scales that we combined into an overall like accuracy measure. And we want to know how well does the fact checker accuracy ratings agree with the Turk ratings. And given that we are interested in scalability, I want to know, so this is what I'm going to show you on the y-axis, the correlation between the average layperson rating and the average fact checker rating. And because this is the scalability question, we're also going to look at it in terms of how large the crowd is. So like how many ratings you get per article, because if the crowd can do really well, but you need 1,000 people to rate every article, that's, that's not going to really help you. And then I'm going to show again, based on whether we tell the crowd the domain that it came from or not. And an important question is, what's going to count as good? Because a correlation of it's sort of hard to interpret on its own. And so we take as our baseline is the correlation between the ratings of the 3 fact checkers, because although you see the 3 fact checkers, their ratings correlated with each other on an average of 0.62, which is pretty high. I mean, I feel like for social science research, I've never gotten a correlation above 0.2 for anything. So 0.6 is very good, but it's also very far from 1. So there's some signal there, but it's a noisy signal, and we wouldn't really expect the crowd to be able to get much better agreement with the fact checkers than the fact checkers have with each other. And what we find is, well, first of all, the source info helps a little bit, although not that much, but sort of more importantly, with about 15 or 20 layperson ratings per headline, you get as much agreement between the crowd and the fact checkers as you have amongst the fact checkers themselves. And so this suggests to us that fairly small crowds can actually do pretty well at identifying this. It works just as well if you look at political versus non-political headlines. And we sort of take this as evidence that for this set of stimuli, crowds actually doing quite well. It's not only true in the US. We also have a paper where we did this big cross-cultural study using COVID headlines, where we had like 45 COVID headlines that we had people rate the accuracy of. We did like 16 different countries. And then we can ask, we have this rating from fact checkers if the headlines are true or false. And you can say, what's the AUC for trying to predict whether the headline is true or false based on the average crowd rating, again, as a function of how big the crowd is. And what you see is with 20 layperson ratings per article, you're getting an AUC of above 0.85 everywhere and above 0.9 almost everywhere. Which when we showed this to our friends at the tech companies, they're like, wow, that's very good. I think that this is, again, evidence that it's not just the US, but that this could work well even in places where there's not great fact-checking.
What do you think is, if I'm reading this right, happening in India? Is that the bottom curve?
Yeah, they're not as good.
That's a very helpful answer. Thank you.
So what we see when we look at the specific ratings is there, like across all the countries, the average of belief in the true headlines is pretty much the same. And for whatever reason, the Indians were particularly likely to believe the false claims. I don't really know, I don't have a good explanation for it. The point of this paper, even though it was a cross-cultural paper, was more to look at regularities across countries rather than trying to explain differences across countries, although the reviewers made us put a bunch of that in.
It does seem also that it's not plateauing as much. I wonder if you got to 100 or 200,
Yeah.
it would get up there. It does seem,
Yeah,
and
that's
maybe
right.
it has something to do with the big country. Certainly the biggest on your, well, I guess China is there. Okay.
Yeah, and also I think some of these are just hitting ceiling effects.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's a good question, and I don't really have a good answer.
Were these with Amazon Capital Church?
So this was using Lucid to recruit samples that were a quota matched to the country on age and gender. The general representativeness was like good on age and gender, and not great on education. In a bunch of the countries, it was a more educated sample than the general population, but pretty well matched on terms of like values. We have like just some different ideological measures from the World Value Survey, and we match pretty well on those. And we also don't actually find that education moderates this much. So if you subset on the low education people within each country, it doesn't look much worse. So we have some hope that this, generalizes.
Just wondering what kind of these were.
Yeah, so there are claims that we took from like the WHO's website and fact-checking sites from various different countries. These are like samples, things about like things that are actually helpful for COVID not being helpful, things that are not actually helpful being helpful, good old microchips, and vaccines being bad kind of claims, and then just like actually accurate claims. So I think all of this is I think evidence that like in general, I guess there's a couple of questions about sampling in the chat. So for the cross-cultural study, we restricted to, obviously it had to be people that had a computer or had some mobile device because we were doing an online survey, and we restricted to people that said they use social media, but we include WhatsApp as a social media thing, which is every person outside of the United States. So that was not really much of a filter. And in terms of the demographics, in the MTurk study, they're MTurkers, so they're not representative, but we made politically balanced groups. So we always got the ratings of half Democrats, half Republicans, and then averaged them. So we create this kind of politically balanced layperson rating. And we also replicated it on Lucid, which has a more representative sample, but a much less attentive sample. And they did worse because they were less attentive, but whatever, it was still not that bad. Okay, right. And so this is what Facebook is doing. They're paying people non-expert rates. They're paying non-experts non-expert rates to evaluate content. Great. But the thing is, this is still not really scalable enough, because even if you're able to pay people MTurk rates and pay like 10 cents a minute to read a headline or whatever, it's still, given the vast amount of content that's posted, this isn't really a good way. This isn't scalable enough to get much of a handle on the volume that's out there. And so if you really want to do it at scale, you need to have just an open system where any person is flagging whatever they feel like.
Just like that scaling point, isn't there a small amount of content that gets spread so widely, the stuff that you really want to go after? Isn't that a lot less content? So you're making a lot of scalability here.
Yeah, I mean,
what do I care if there's a whole lot of stuff that nobody sees?
That's fair, but I think there's, even if you set the, I guess the question is, what is a lot of people? But even if you threshold on stuff that 1,000 people see or something like that, there's an uncountable amount of that content. And also, I think part of the idea is you want to try to catch it before a lot of people see it, because once it's out, it's out. And so part of this, I should say, it's not just, when I say scale, it's not just total volume, but it's also speed. You want to be the minute something sketchy comes across the radar, you can get a rating on it.
Thanks.
I believe Jonathan Haidt said the number of Russian bots, sinister Russian bots, is in the millions. And if they got caught and somehow extinguished, did they automatically get born somewhere else?
I don't know, the whole bot thing, nobody knows. Nobody knows what's going on with bots. It's very hard to tell what's a bot and what's not. You know,
Without another layer of legislation.
yeah, I think period. But you know, it's really, who knows? You know, on the internet, nobody knows you're a cat, right? Like, I think the bot thing is a whole separate issue. Let's say. So I would say like that's a topic for another talk. Because I will talk a little bit about bots in a minute. But so okay, so like in a general situation where anybody out on the web can flag whatever they want. That is good in the sense that that's like the way that you are able to do this at scale is by harnessing like all of the billions of users to help you identify the bad things. But this creates two major problems that are not present in the model that Facebook uses or that we did in our other study, which is we're just saying you rate this, what do you think? Okay, now with this, what do you think? Now what this, what do you think? The first one is you're much more vulnerable to partisan extremists because people can have coordinated attacks that can go out and seek the stuff that they don't like and and attack it. And also you're not kind of filtering to only the people that you decide to hire to be contractors. So on the one hand, you have the possibility of bad flags getting reduced. And on the other hand, you have a public goods problem, which is this approach relies on people being willing to essentially donate their time to go and flag things to benefit the tech company and society. And so this is a problem of being worried there's not going to be enough flags because why should anyone do it? What I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is I'm going to talk about this project where we try and think about like both of these problems and in general how things work in a situation where it's open for people to flag what they want. I'm going to start with a little very simple theoretical reflection on this and just think about what is it that motivates people to flag in the first place. I'm going to focus on two motivations. First, you might be willing to spend time flagging content because you care about the truth and you want to reduce the reach of inaccurate content. And that's what we love, and that's the dream of the whole thing, right? But also, you might flag things because you care about partisanship. And so if you're like a strong partisan, then you would want to reduce the exposure of counter-partisan content and boost the exposure of co-partisan content, regardless of whether it's true or not. Obviously, this we like, and this we're concerned about. And just to unpack why, if you imagine in the simplest version where you've got four types of content, the content is either true or false, and it's either aligned with your politics or it's not. If you have an accuracy motive, then you're going to flag the false stuff, regardless of whether it's aligned, which is good. And if you care about partisanship, then you're going to flag the discordant stuff, regardless of whether it's true or false, which is bad. And it also, you might, if you had both motivations, then you might not flag the false discordant stuff. You might not flag the false concordant stuff, because even though it's false, you like it because it, supports your party or whatever. And so from this take, you would think, well, accuracy motive good, partisan motive bad. And what I want to do is use this very simple little model to think a little bit more concretely about what is the role, what is the impact of a partisan motive. So if you're trying to decide, should I flag something or not, you could say, okay, I get some utility from flagging it if it's false. So this B1 is how much I like the strength of my accuracy motive. And then I get some utility from flagging it if it's discordant, or I lose that utility if it's concordant. And this is the sort of partisan motive. And then without loss of generality, I just normalize the cost of flagging to 1. And so basically from this, you can say for any piece of content, what's the utility I get from flagging it? And then I just say, we're going to map from the utility you get to the actual probability of flagging using a logistic function. So using this, we can now say, all right, well, for a given strength of accuracy motive and partisan motive, what are people going to wind up flagging? One thing that comes out of this model is it predicts that no one will ever flag something that is true and concordant, because you would never have any motive. Neither motive makes you want to flag that stuff. If you think of it as the partisan motive increases, it always is going to increase the bias in flagging, which is to say, it's going to increase. It's going to make you more likely to flag discordant claims relative to concordant claims. And this is the concern that everyone bring to the table about partisan motives being bad. But the question is, what's the effect of the partisan motives on discernment? That is like the extent to which you're flagging true versus false headlines. This is, so we define discernment as the number of false flags, the number of false claims flagged, which is good, minus the number of true claims flagged, which is bad. So like the higher the discernment, the more discerning you are in your flagging, the more precision it is, the better everything is. And so I made this cool looking picture. And so what this picture is I'm varying the accuracy motive on the y-axis, I'm varying the partisan motive on the x-axis. And what I'm looking at is the change in discernment as a result of increasing the partisan motive. So like this is sort of normalized to be one all along this axis, and then we say like as you move across, it's how is the discernment changing relative to what it is here as you increase the partisan motive. And to make this a little bit more concrete, say if we take this slice to here, the partisan motive is strong. And so what you see is that like, here, the accuracy motive is strong. So you got a strong accuracy motive. If you have no partisan motive, then you flag the false discordant stuff, you flag the false concordant stuff, and you never flag the true discordant stuff, and everything is beautiful. And then as you increase the as you increase the partisan motive, you stop flagging the false concordant stuff, and you start flagging the true discordant stuff, and that's bad. And so discernment is very good here, and discernment is quite bad here, because you're flagging lots of true stuff and you're not flagging lots of false stuff. And so you see, as the partisan motive increases, discernment gets worse and worse.
Do you have some kind of ideal observer here where you have to assume that the user has perfect knowledge of what's true and false?
Yes, that's right. So in this model, I'm abstracting out the issue of also there's a problem if they don't know what they're mixed up or whatever.
Right. Okay.
But so like even putting that aside, like partisanship is bad. But even if everyone had personal information, if everyone had perfect information, it's still right. If they were motivated, if they had a strong accuracy motive, having more of a partisan motive would be bad. Then on the other hand, we can look down here where people have like a really weak accuracy motive. And so at baseline, they don't flag anything because they don't care enough to flag anything. And then as you increase the partisan motive, they start flagging discordant stuff, regardless of whether it's false or true. They're slightly more likely to flag the false stuff than the true stuff because they care accuracy a little bit, but it's not great, right? Like here, when the accuracy motive is strong, when the partisan motive is strong, you're getting it's not very precise, you're getting lots of flags that you don't want, of them flagging stuff that is misaligned with the politics, but true. So far, this is kind of like, yes, partisanship is bad, just as everybody expected. But the thing that I found surprising about this when I started thinking about it is what happens, like I think there's very few people that really care a huge amount about accuracy. And also our work suggests there's also not very many people that really don't care about accuracy at all. I think most people, yeah, they care about accuracy. They don't care about accuracy that much. So the question is, what's happening in this region where people have sort of like middling accuracy motives? And so just looking at this, what you can see is that as the partisan motive increases, it's actually increasing discernment. It's increasing the quality of what they flag up to a point where if it gets too extreme, then things get worse. But a little bit of partisan motive is good. And to see why, you can decompose it like this. So if there's no partisan motive, because they don't care that much about accuracy, they don't flag anything. But then as with a bit of partisan motive, they start flagging only the false discordant stuff. Because they don't care enough about accuracy to flag just because it's false. They don't care enough about partisanship to flag just because it's discordant. But if it's both false and discordant, then they're mad. And then they're willing to like invest the time to go and flag with them. And so the sort of take home of this is that it's actually not as obvious as we might have thought, like whether partisan motives are going to help or hurt what's going on here. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is I'm going to do some empirical evaluating of what actually, what role is partisanship actually happening in sort of like flagging settings. The first way that I'm going to do that is using an experiment. Oh, sorry, this is just a summary. Yeah, just to summarize. So partisan motives are always going to make people more biased in the sense of more likely to flag stuff from the other party than themselves. But you know, the effect on actual discernment is going to vary. It's going to be bad if the accuracy motive is strong. It's going to be neutral if the accuracy motive is really weak. And it can actually be positive if the accuracy motive is intermediate, which, as I said, I think ex ante, there is reason to believe that this is going to be true for a lot of people. So first we ran an experiment. This was actually the pilot, and the like 2,000 person version of this is running as we speak. So, you know, meet with the grad students tomorrow and find out what happened. But we replicated this a couple of pilots already, so it's good. What we do is we recruit, like in this one, about 400 people, Americans from Lucid, quota match the US on demographics. And we do a setup that is different from what I've ever done before, where so we give them the chance to volunteer to help social media companies identify misinformation, and then they're showed a newsfeed and they can flag articles as false and misleading and write an explanation. And what's different from what I've done is, like, on the first screen of the experiment, we say, we are researchers at MIT, we advise tech companies, we do research on wisdom of crowds, we wrote this Time magazine article about how crowds are good at identifying misinformation. Like, in this task, we're going to help you, basically, we're going to ask you to help, like, identify misinfo. We'll share your ratings with tech companies to help inform, you know, what they're actually doing. And then we're like, but actually you don't have to do it. Do you want to flag or do you not want to flag? And about half the people opt out, which I think is consistent with the baseline premise that most people don't care that much about either accuracy or partisanship. And they're just like out there, you know, doing their thing. But the people that do opt in, they get shown some false headlines, some right-leaning, some left-leaning, some non-news stimuli, and some true headlines, which I guess I skipped by. And then it's like in this kind of scrolling news feed format where they can scroll along and be like, yeah, okay, fine, fine, fine. And then ones that they decide are not good, they click the little flag button. And then if they flag it, they have to write a little explanation for why they think it's not good, just to add some cost of flagging. And also because, you know, in the real application of this, these, you know, these comments could actually be useful. So, okay, that's the basic setup. And what I'm going to start by doing is just looking at the overall flagging behavior. So for each of the different types of news, you've got news that's, you know, false and aligned with their politics, false and not aligned with their politics, non-news, like the celebrity kind of stuff, true aligned with their politics, true not aligned with their politics. I'm going to say what fraction of headlines of each type got flagged. And the first thing we see, if you look at the false headlines, as we might expect, they are more likely to flag false headlines that disagree with their politics compared to false headlines that do agree with their politics. Fine. And so that, you know, is, you know, that's good in some sense because the false stuff is getting flagged. And the question is, what happens with the true stuff? And the concern is that you would also see a lot of flagging of stuff that is true, but discordant with their politics. And we don't see that. We see, you know, 20% more flagging of bad stuff and basically no difference in the flagging of the good stuff.
Am I reading the vertical axis right? That's 6%. It's only 6%.
Yes, most people are not flagging most content.
And how many of the articles were actually false?
Well, in each category, this is saying of the false articles, 6% of them got flagged.
Oh, of the false.
Yeah.
So they don't, either they don't know they're false or they don't care enough to flag it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But also if you think about it, it's like they're scrolling through like 100 headlines or something like that. So people are not going to flag.
Because
every
there's the
single one.
cost of.
Yeah, exactly. So like you have, it's like 6% per person, per person headline.
Yeah.
The base rates are important here. These 5 categories were not equally represented in the stories that they saw.
Well, there was 15 of each of the news categories, and I think there was maybe twice as many of the non-news. But the four news categories were all equally common.
You say 20% more false, well, the percentage change for true also looks significant. The percentage change.
Right, the percentage change, but the, I mean, it's like not literally significant because of the base rate, it's so low, but you're right that there is some little bit of change there, but because the base rate is so much lower, the actual magnitude of that is substantially larger than the magnitude of that. And you'll see in a minute that, hold that for a second. So overall, the crowd is doing a good job. And they are doing a bit better for the headlines that are misaligned with their politics compared to the headlines that are aligned with their politics. But the thing that I think is particularly interesting here is to look at the role of polarization and political motives. So what we did is at the start of the experiment, we used 3 different measures of polarization. We did affective polarization, which is the standard feeling thermometer measures from political science, and basically how hot versus cold do you feel about Democrats, how hot versus cold do you feel about Republicans, and then you take I think we used the out party, like how you feel about the people from the other party as our measure of affective polarization. We also measured issue polarization, where about a bunch of different issues, we asked them how they felt about it, and you can see how polarized their views on the issues were. And we also measured political knowledge, which is often wrapped up in with sort of political engagement, and being politically active also means you would sort of know more about politics. And if you do a principal component analysis on these 3 different dimensions, you get a first component that weights all 3 of them equally. So we just average the 3 of them as this general measure of like how partisan are you, how politically engaged are you?
You assume that hot in party was positive and hot out party was negative?
Yes, that's right. So basically, being affectively polarized means you are cold about the out party.
But if you're mad as hell at the out party, would you be hot?
Oh, and they describe the cold means you don't like them, and hot means, or like warm. It's like cold versus warm. It's some standard measure. Basically, saying that do not like them or do like them. It's from looking at the distribution, people are not confused. It's like the out party one is just like all basically at 0. It's particularly, yeah.
They're less confused than I am.
Yes, because I didn't give you the full instructions. Yeah, this is like a standard instrument that the political scientists use all the time for this. And then, so what I'm going to do now is, we do all kinds of regressions in the paper, but I'm just going to do a median split on the sort of like polarization measure, because it's one of these things where you don't need stats, because you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, okay. So, but it all works when you knew it with the stats also. So what I'm going to show you now is that same picture of the fraction of headlines of each of the types that are flagged for the sort of less polarized subjects versus the more polarized subjects. And what you see is that for the more polarized, so the more versus less polarized subjects are equally likely to flag stuff that is false and aligned with their politics. But the people that are polarized, they are, substantially more likely to flag the stuff that is false and they disagree with, but they're actually less likely to flag all of the true stuff. And okay, fine. So maybe they're still a little bit more likely to flag the true discordant and the true concordant. But if you look at the overall level of discernment and flagging, and also the quantity of good flags, it's way higher for the polarized subjects than for the less polarized subjects. And like I said, if you do the regressions, polarization correlates positively with both bias, right? Because they're more likely to flag the discordant stuff than the concordant stuff, and with discernment, because they're more likely to flag the false stuff than the true stuff. And they also contribute a higher number of flags. So this is like the key result from the survey experiments is that the polarized subjects are actually doing a better job, driven largely by being more likely to flag the stuff that is both false and they disagree with.
Is everybody flagging the same article that they're coming to? Like, what's the coverage across the feed of articles that are false that aren't getting flagged?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We haven't looked, it's on our list and we haven't looked at that yet, but it's obviously, it's an important question.
The worry would be that there's clumping on the most egregious falsehoods and that they're not getting further into the more squishy ones.
Right, yeah. And we have pretest ratings for all these of like how accurate people think they are. And so we can look at sort of flag probability as a function of plausibility, essentially. Yeah, it's a good idea. Okay, so well, yeah, like I said, they're most likely to flag the false discordant ones. Discernment is pretty good, even though the overall rate of flagging is quite low, as people notice. And the more polarized people are more discerning, largely because they're more likely to flag the false discordant news. So that makes me happy.
I'm wondering, I guess the instructions were just flag whatever you feel like, and you don't have to examine every one of them.
Right, so you can scroll through it, and basically, if one, you can choose, if you think something's bad, you can flag it and write why.
How, if at all, do you think the results would differ if you required people to flag or not flag every item we saw?
Well, then I feel like it's more like the first study we did, where we just showed them one after the other and asked them to evaluate every single one. And I think if that happened, it would be way better. Because you don't have this problem of most people skipping most items. But that's, I feel like, sort of like the point of this design in some sense, as to what happens if you move a step in the direction of the real thing where you've got a feed and you can be much more selective about what you decide to spend your time flagging versus not flagging.
Do you think that choices might be related to how familiar they are with the content, that the content they feel more expert on in any way?
It's possible, although what we have found repeatedly, actually the first thing that we ever found when we started in the first fake news experiment we ran in 2017 is that people are actually worse. They're worse at telling true for false for items they're familiar with compared to items that they're not, because typically the way you come to be familiar with something is by like, because you're familiar with that kind of stuff if you're into that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
You're trusting political scientists, the same political scientists that are predicting the elections wrong.
Different political scientists.
Different.
The different subfields.
The definition of affective polarization, one definition I heard is fear of the other side, and anger at the other side. And so I'm wondering, I come from psychometrics, so the psychology scientist would, I think, might have a more accurate measurement of anger and fear than the political scientist. And I wonder if that is even possible, or are you just taking off the shelf?
I mean, my sense is that, so basically this is like about like how much do you dislike the people from the other side, is this measure that we're using. There are a bunch of these measures. I think like all three of the affective polarization, the issue polarization, and the political knowledge are all pretty strongly correlated with each other, and the correlations with the outcomes are super strong. So my guess is it's not going to matter that much how you operationalize it.
Since we're on this point, I think if you just ask people how polarized they are, they'll tell you the answer. Like, I don't think you have to actually ask it indirectly. I think you just ask people and they'll tell you.
Well, I think part of the idea behind this measurement scheme is that for people that are into polarization, there's like they like to make a difference between affective polarization and issue polarization. And they always complain also that it's confounded with political knowledge. And so we want to know
that's fair.
And if you put all three of them in a model, they all are sort of independently predictive and stuff like that. Okay, so this is all, I think, makes me happy. But there's like really major caveats with this, which is some survey experiment context. And so even though we tell them we're going to share the stuff with social media companies and whatever, first of all, these are people that select into doing academic studies. So they may have stronger accuracy motives than the people out in the wild doing this stuff. And because like the partisan motives might be weaker in the survey context because it's not actually out on real social media. So, and someone asks in the chat or the question, like, what effect they think there was from people knowing that they were in a study. So again, that's another problem with this, is they know they're in a study. Although actually, I didn't frame it, I didn't describe it as a study. We just said, we have already studied this stuff before, and now we're just looking to recruit people to help identify false claims for social media companies. But it's still, not a super organic context. So what we do for the last thing is we go and look at real field data. And what we use for the field data is Twitter, because that's what everybody always uses for all field data. Sorry, social media studies joke. Okay, but in particular, the reason we look at Twitter is because Twitter recently introduced this thing called Birdwatch, which is exactly what we have in the survey experiments, but on actual Twitter. And so I'm on the advisory board for it, so we got special access to the data from the pilot phase of it, where they invited anybody that was interested to sign up, and then they created a sample of 4,000 of these people, trying to make them sort of a diverse sample on various different dimensions. And then the way the program works is if you're a bird watcher, then while you're scrolling through your feed or on a special site that lists all of the things that other bird watchers have flagged, you can flag tweets as potentially misleading and write an explanation about why, and then other people see your explanation and just to see what it looks like. For example, Amazon had some post about how can you believe that, that basically they're so great to their workers. And then you see this note says, this is potentially misleading. Amazon has a documented history of labor violations. And so we've been working on this same thing. I think they started running the pilot in the beginning of the year and thought this was very cool. And then Elon Musk took over Twitter, and we were like, oh God, what's going to happen because he doesn't like content moderation? But it turns out this is actually the one thing that he does like, because you can't complain about it, liberal bias and censorship and whatever. He called it Community Notes, even though it was called Birdwatch. And so then they had to rename it Community Notes. So now it's called Community Notes. And then like another example that happened recently is so Musk shared this like doctored image that is just like blatantly not true. And then it got flagged by bird watchers saying that like it's not real and it came from a satire website. And then Musk responded to that saying Community Notes for the win. And I think there were some claims that, oh, he did this on purpose to test if Community Notes was captured or not. I don't really believe that, but whatever. The point is, it is now in the wild, it is operating, and it seems, fingers crossed, like something that he is not going to kill. So be that as may, now we want to know what actually happens. And so what we did is we examined like more than 1,100 flags of 352 tweets. And of those flags, 96% of them were people flagging it as potentially misleading. There was very few people flagging something as not misleading, which just means people use this as a flagging thing, as we would expect. So I'm going to ignore the 4% of flags that were saying, actually, this is fine. And what we did is we hired 2 professional fact checkers to research each of the 352 tweets and rate it as either potentially misleading or not. And then I'm going to call something like false. Really, it just means like misleading, but whatever. To keep the nomenclature consistent across the parts of the talk, I'm going to call something false if either of the fact checkers said it was potentially misleading, and I'm going to call it true if both of the fact checkers said it wasn't misleading. And then I can also infer the partisanship of the tweeter and the partisanship of the person that flagged the tweet based on the accounts that they follow using the standard method. And so then I'm going to call a flag concordant if the flagger and the tweet writer are from the same party. I'm going to call it discordant if they're from different parties.
Just a mechanical question. So once a tweet is flagged by one person, is it permanently flagged forever, or can someone anti-flag it or deflag it, or do you get a count of the number of flags or something like that?
Yeah, so what happens is if you flag it and write a note, then in the actual Birdwatch system, what happens is there's this Birdwatch site where any person can go and see all of the notes that have been written. And so if you wrote a note on a tweet, I could also write a note on a tweet. If you write a note saying this tweet is inaccurate, I could write another note saying, no, I think it's accurate and here's why. And then there's a whole other part of the Birdwatch platform that I'm not talking about here, but that is a really integral part of how it actually works in the wild, which is people can also rate the tweets as helpful or not helpful. And then they have some algorithm to try to decide which are actually helpful tweets. And then they only show tweets on the main Twitter site if they are rated helpful tweets. But it's more complicated than just counting the fraction of flags that are positive. We have this Kai paper where we show that you can, like, the average fraction of helpful flags for any given note is almost entirely determined by the fraction of raters that were co-partisans. So like they're doing more complicated things. Actually, I guess I've talked about this in a slide or two, but basically what they are doing is kind of bridging algorithms where they say if at least some people from both sides say that the note is helpful, then that's some evidence that it's like a reasonably good note.
Another operational question. What's the content service algorithm that's feeding stuff to someone who is a bird watcher? Are they getting a personalized algorithm, or are they getting stuff that's coming off of a different site?
So neither of those, nobody's feeding them anything. It's just like while they're using Twitter as regular Twitter users, they can just flag whatever they see, or they can go to the Birdwatch site and look at tweets that other people have flagged. And
so they're
chime in.
like whatever the standard content service algorithm is of any other Twitter user.
Right.
How much discordant stuff are they seeing?
Right, so that's a really interesting thing. And one of the things that we show in the Kai paper is, well, I guess I'm about to show a version of this also is, well, so first of all, actually, this is one of the interesting things about social media is like the echo chambers don't actually exist. And people, although people are much more likely to share concordant stuff, people are actually exposed, at least politically active people are, well, whatever, I think politically active people are more preferential in their sharing, whatever. People actually see a lot of discordant content, although a lot of times they see it because it's co-partisans dunking on the counter-partisan content.
Can I just, here you switched and you said you're using concordant and discordant based on source.
Right.
And before you were using it based on content, and now you're just describing it as content, but
Yeah.
maybe you mean, well,
I'm using source as a proxy basically because we don't have a way of actually like, I mean, I guess we could have had raters rate this the same way we have
that's a
them
pretty
rate the
big
other one. but-
difference. I mean, the other one, you saw the difference that source made in ranked ratings, and here you're saying it's just a.
Yeah, so we're using it as a proxy. I guess that's a fair point that we might as well, as long as we're doing this, it would be easy to get Turkers to rate
Well, or at
the
least
actual
not use
content.
this- I mean, because of how you're using the term.
Yeah, I mean, my guess, I would put a good amount of money on the fact that if we have the people rate the actual lean of the content, it will line up very well with what we're doing here. But that's obviously that's just me asserting that.
It might, or it might also be that people are using source as a proxy and are part of why they're choosing to evaluate content is source information, because you have source information here all the time.
I guess, but people don't know the partisanship of the sources. It's not because it's not like Fox News. It's like Bob.
Maybe, I mean, some people's Twitter things.
But anyways, I said it's a good question, and so we'll do that. Basically, I'll get Turkers to rate it and see what happens. I'm just actually writing myself a note to do that. Rate. Yeah. Okay, so the key question that we wanted to know then is like what what are the people flagging here that it's actually in the wild and everybody's doing their thing. And so I'm going to show you the fraction of all flag content that is false versus true and discordant versus concordant. And consistent with what we found in the survey experiment, but like way stronger. Also consistent with the fact that the partisan motives are much stronger in the real thing than in the wild. In the real thing than in the survey. There is like much more flagging of discordant false content than anything else. But still, there's very little flagging of the like not misleading stuff, even if it's discordant. And here, I think to the question that you were raising about the survey experiment, here, clearly, this difference is way bigger than that difference. You know, this again, primarily what people are doing is flagging stuff that is both false and they disagree with. And there's very little of people flagging things that they disagree with, but is actually not misleading.
What do you think the effect was of the fact that these people signed up to be a bird watcher and then know that they might get kicked out of the program if they, you know, mark things that are true as actually being false? Relative to the survey where it was just random.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when they signed up, I don't think there was clear guidelines about what was going to get them kicked out or not get kicked out. But that is actually something that I will return to in a minute, because that is a critical part of how this actually works when it gets sufficiently big. But there's the basic question of like, is this actually good? Like, are the crowd doing well? 80% of the potentially misleading flags were for tweets that were also rated as potentially misleading by at least one of the fact checkers. So I think that's like quite a good level of precision. And again, political motivations help rather than hurt. For example, if all of the discordant tweets were treated like concordant tweets, so that's one way of imagining there's no partisan like motive, then you would get a similar level of agreement with the fact checkers, but you'd only get half as many flags contributed. And you can also look at the level of the individual rather than the level of the flag. And you know, at the user level, we can estimate the extremity of their partisanship by essentially like how much they tend to tend to follow people only from one party versus, you know, a mix. And the more extreme partisans, that was like the best predictor of the total number of flags contributed. So the more extreme people are sort of the better contributors. So I think this suggests that even out in the wild, this will work, but obviously there's some big problems potentially. So one thing is that although the precision is high, we don't know what they're missing, and presumably they're missing lots of stuff. So that's one issue. Another issue is that like here, it's kind of like the two sides police each other. Like each side is flagging the false discordant stuff from the other side, then that's great and they keep each other in check. But if you have two sides roughly equally, you know, sized, but if you have either political or social contexts that have a lot of asymmetry built into it, then you can have a real problem. On the one hand, simply like, you know, one side's misinformation is going to get missed more than the other side's, but much more concerning, you can also have sort of tyranny of the majority thing, where the majority party, like, or the majority side, if they believe false things about the minority side, they can certify those things as true. So these are issues that need to get worked out. Also, you just have, if polarization is the thing that's solving the public good problem, then you just have poor coverage for non-polarized topics. Like in the birdwatch data that we looked at, almost all of the notes, the tweets that got flagged were about politics or COVID, which isn't politics. And so, you know, that's another problem, because there's lots of other kinds of misinformation, like financial misinformation and other kinds of non-polarized health misinformation and stuff like that. That's super important, and that the partisan motive is not going to drive people to flag. And the other problem, which relates to the question that you were asking about getting kicked off, and also relates to the question of bots, is that if you have a small number of actors that contribute a large number of bad flags, maybe because they're using bots to amplify things or whatever, that causes a real problem. You know, they can either they can post bad flags, they can also coordinate to downvote good flags and upvote bad flags and stuff like that. And so this, I think, is actually the biggest challenge, is not just trying to avoid partisanship, but find the really extreme bad actors. And so one way of doing this, and this is what Birdwatch is working on right now, community notes, whatever, is that essentially you have to earn the right to, you have to earn in, like you're saying, that, you know, in order for you to be able to contribute, like you can write whatever you want, in order for anybody to see the notes that you're writing, you have to have some kind of established track record that shows that you're a good actor. And then if you start behaving badly, you lose that right.
You can see an easy way around this, which is let's see that all the things that have been marked on Birdwatch as false correctly. Write a script to go and mark all those, and then once you're accepted, start doing bad stuff.
Yeah, and I think that yes, so you figuring out the details of how to like work the reputation system is like the key question, and I think that's a lot of what they're working on. Because it may also be like you have to write notes that other people rate as helpful. Right, because there's like the ratings and then there's the note writing. So if I was going to do it, the way that I would do it is I would say in order for your notes to be shown and like to be eligible for your people to see your notes, you have to write a bunch of notes that other people rate as helpful notes. Yeah. And then once you've written enough good notes, you'd be like, okay, now you can go out and and do your thing. And that is harder to do like that.
I was kind of wondering if you took things that you knew were true and then made them false and showed them to people to see if they got them or not, as a way to kind of vet people.
Yeah, that's cool. So it's like throwing in some that you know the answer for.
Yeah,
that's good too. Totally. Yeah. Yep. Okay.
I'm struck by the analogy of what you just described to the way that Wikipedia handles this problem, right? Where there are editors who have earned some credibility, whose job it is to police the truth value of edits conducted or posted by partisans.
Right, totally. And so this is sort of has that flavor where like, if it's a system of like, you have to write enough notes that people that have a good reputation rate as good, then it's sort of like the system, like the moderators essentially have to vet the new people. Yeah.
And there's actually a paper about Wikipedia, which is really called The Wisdom of Polarized Crowds. So I look at this on Wikipedia, kind of by default, right? You get polarized teams, they call it, fighting over one article that tends to have higher quality.
Yeah, totally.
Maybe the question for them, but do you have any ideas how to generalize this to other sites of services?
I mean, I think the fact that basically we find it to work in the survey experiment makes me think it's not anything specific to Twitter. It's just like, in general, most people don't care that much about politics and people don't care that much about accuracy. And so like you need both of those things in the mix to motivate people to actually go and flag. And wherever you go, there's going to be some small number of bad actors that are trouble. And those are the people that you need to worry about.
So is it a small number, or because you have leaders who would stir them up to attack, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that it's interesting to think about like I guess it depends. A small fraction of the people, and so then the question is if the total number, if they have to earn in, then like you need people that are going to spend a lot of time to like infiltrate the thing, and then depending on like how quickly, basically if they write notes that other people say are bad, then they get kicked out. And
seems to be a lot of motivated people to do that sort of thing.
We also have GPT-3 that can start automating.
I was thinking about that as I was saying. I was like, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the GPT-3 plays here. All right, so basically, I'm over. So let me just quickly say that like. And then one side benefit of this that I'll skip is we have this other work that shows that if you just ask people to rate the accuracy of content while they're online, it actually increases the quality of what they share because it just primes the concept of accuracy. Like we did this Twitter field experiment where we found like, 5,000 people that have been sharing links to Breitbart articles, and we sent them a DM just asking them to rate the accuracy of this one random headline. And then we looked at what they tweeted subsequently, and we found a significant increase in the quality of the news that they shared afterwards. To see like a significant decrease in the fraction of their tweets to these like really bad sites, and increase in fraction of their tweets to more credible sites. So that's like side benefit of getting people involved in the rating of content. Okay, so just to summarize, I think professional fact checking is great, but it can't keep up with the scale of the problem. The wisdom of crowds can help platforms identify misinformation at scale, and soliciting ratings has the side benefit of just priming accuracy and getting people to share less bad stuff in the first place. But if you do this, it creates a public goods problem of why should people bother to rate at all? And what we've suggested is that in general, the partisan motivations are actually helping solve the public goods problem rather than polluting the pool of lots of crap. And so it suggests that platforms, what they should be doing is searching for the really bad actor zealots rather than just to kick out, rather than trying to limit to just the nonpartisan saints, because there aren't. And I guess as a final thought, I think that like the partisan motivations helps this a little bit, but it's very far from a complete solution. And so I think that we also have to think about like what are other ways of really solving the public goods problem and motivating people to rate. And I think reputation mechanisms, on the positive side of reputation mechanisms, are like a really promising direction for that. So that's something we're working on with Jigsaw, with Google, where we're trying to do like what they did for Google Maps, where they get all these people to contribute to Google Maps by like, you can be a local guide and you can level up and you can see all your stats and all the things that people, how many people saw your pictures and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to try and see if you can build something similar like that for the internet, essentially. So thanks to you guys, thanks to these guys, thanks to those people.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions from online or the audience. If anyone needs to leave, go ahead.
So misinformation is, as of now at least, it's political in nature. You get misinformation, fake news. Do you think that disparity between the false flagging of discordant and concordant content, do you think those flaggers were in a sense using that flagging mechanism rather than like altruistic motives? It's more of like their own version of political activism going after misinformation.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in some sense, that's what I feel like, what I meant by this partisan motive, right? And so it's like, one reason you might flag something is the kind of altruistic, like, well, I don't like that it's false. But another reason you might flag something is because you're like, and you know, trying to do advocacy or like activism or whatever. But I think the idea is most people don't actually care that much about either of those things. And so it's not enough for it to be, you know, something you just like politically. It's like you're only willing to like really get off your button and flag it if it's both false and discordance, where it activates both the kind of altruistic and the partisan motive.
With regard to the solutions that came up speculatively at the end, does that make this a version of social contract theory that would be recognizable by political theorists? And the second part of the question, if so, what are the politics of dealing with people who don't accept social contract, which is always a trouble with social contract theory?
It's a great question. I would say I have been hanging out with political scientists for 5 years. So I learned a couple of things from them, but I'm not actually a political scientist. So I don't actually know enough to have a good answer to the first of your question. Oh, the first part of your question. By the way, the main two things that I learned from hanging out with political scientists for 5 years that I didn't know ahead of time is most people don't care about politics, and elite cues have a huge effect. That like when political elites say a thing, it really influences the beliefs of their followers. And actually, just as, this is not your question, but as a side note, we were talking about this before, but for me, in terms of doing misinformation research, I think the thing that is like what we're really focused on now is elite misinformation from political elites. And I think that's a way bigger problem than random people retweeting, you know, random things that anybody can post anything on the internet. Yeah, but nobody cares unless an elite amplifies it, basically. But in terms of the second one, how do you deal with people that don't want to be part of it? I think in this case, if they don't like it, they'll go to a different platform. And I am okay with that, but you know.
I just wanted to sort of add more evidence to some of the things you mentioned. So I think earlier somebody had asked why is like India so off on the charts. So I've been trying to conduct something similar in India with sort of reasonably well-educated college students, and you can get to interview them after the thing is over. One thing we found was that it was fairly common for them to sort of conflate opinion and accuracy. So if you were to ask them, here's a story about Ukraine returning its nuclear weapons 10 years ago, do you think it's true or false? They might give it a rating of, let's say, 70 out of 100, and afterwards, if you ask them, what do you think actually? Oh yeah, I support that they returned the, that's one. The second is about the point on tyranny mattering in social corrections. So unlike the US, where you sort of have a seesaw or roughly equal balance, in India right now, you have a fairly dominant majority and a minority. And what we found was, so our experiment was with close pairs of friends who were supposed to know each other and each other's political preferences. Naturally, like in any setting, people in the majority had friends who also supported the political majority minority. But we noticed that, first of all, so the people in the minority had a double informational disadvantage. So the first was that they were very reluctant to share false news that favored their party. So they would only share something if it was extremely likely to be true. So they shared much less overall. They were also much less likely to know that their friend supported the same party as they did, even though they were close friends. So there was like a double censoring of self.
Yeah, I think figuring out how to operate in these asymmetric environments is really important. And to me, it's a sort of like algorithmic question of like, given that you have, you're going to get what you're going to get from the people, and then how do you figure out how to say these are the good ones that we should actually show to people, and these are the things that are like not good for one reason or another.
So I'm thinking about how the whole birdwatcher community notes thing is sort of transferring the question, which is a political question, to whoever is in that pool of birdwatchers, right? And given what Elon Musk has been doing since he took over Twitter, like letting Trump back in, letting Kanye West back in, Marjorie Taylor Greene's followers have quadrupled. What is going to happen when he starts putting those people into the birdwatch community? So like, when you have Marjorie Taylor Greene's followers in birdwatch, are they going to start marking tweets that are, say, from the CDC on vaccines, and they're going to add notes to that? Do you think that is likely, or what do you think will happen when the population changes?
Yeah, I mean, and so I think the hope of this kind of like bridging algorithm type idea is that like, if you have to have a reasonable set of people on both sides saying that a note is good for it to show up, then if you get cranks from one side that are writing lots of, you know, unreasonable things, and nobody from the other side thinks that it's reasonable, it doesn't show up.
So is that how it's working right now?
It's, yeah, I mean, so the algorithm's open. The cool thing about Birdwatch is it's totally open, so you can see exactly what the algorithm is. Of course, you can't understand it because it's an algorithm, right? But like, theoretically, it's open. They posted a cool working paper like about their approach and some survey evidence validating it that describes it in much better detail than I can. But to my understanding, that's the intuition behind the approach.
What about using a CAPTCHA-like system? Has that been tried? Like a completely automated public Turing test, right? You prove you're not a robot, and you have to click and while you're doing that, you're also labeling a huge image database, right? So has that been tried to combat this? Because obviously one of the problems is how do you motivate people to participate, right? And so what they did to label this image database.
Yeah, it's a cool idea. I mean, so I guess the way that would work here is something like when you first log on before you get to see your feed, you have to rate something.
Which statements are true or false?
Right, and you don't know, and like there's ground truth for some of them and not others, and you don't know whether this is one that has ground truth or not. And because that's the idea with the capture, right? Because like the reason that recapture worked is you thought that you had to do it right in order to get through it. Otherwise, because you could just type in some garbage, and so you need like to have some uncertainty about whether this is the one where we know the right answer, and if you just get it wrong, you don't get to enter or not. And yeah, so I mean, I think that would be cool. We've talked about things like that. The challenge with the platforms always is there's like, a few people there that care about misinformation and are working on it, but all the other people essentially care about maximizing time on platform and engagement. And so things that interfere with the user experience, like making people do something annoying before they're allowed to get to their feed, faces a very large hurdle to actually get implemented.
But so also imagine if you're not let through because you checked something that you thought was true as true and turns out it's actually false, then you have like a very strong claim like this website's not letting me in because they don't agree with mine.
It needs a little bit of thinking, but yeah, it's.
All right, well, thank you all for your participation.
Thanks so much.